Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. This is a podcast where we break down and destroy false idols and icons of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. In this episode, we have everyone's favorite returning guest host, Dave, here. I am your host, Georgina Rose. I'm a perennialist and polytheist, and this podcast discusses everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this episode, I have quite a few things I need to say before we start, but I'll make it very, very quick. We are going to be discussing the decline of modern occult publishing and how the vast majority of books that are coming out on occultism are really not very good, why that problem exists, and what the solutions for it are, because we are people who interact with a lot of new practitioners, and we're seeing a lot of new practitioners experience negative impacts and a lot of confusion, overwhelm, and all these negative emotions that really do need to be addressed because new occultists need to be advocated for and not just preyed upon. But of course, because we are talking about occult publishing, which is somewhat of a niche area, I would like to disclaim that this is not meant to upset anyone or attack anyone. We will not be naming specific books or specific publishers to protect people's privacy and to not cause a shit show of drama. But we'll be speaking about broad cultural trends and giving new people insight into what to avoid and discussing the problem at large. This is not drama. This is not any of that, not a call out, none of that. I don't believe in cancel culture. I don't believe in call outs. This is simply a conversation about how occult publishing is leading a lot of people in a bad direction and is fundamentally declining in quality. Because we want people who are new occultists to have the highest quality material possible because your spiritual journey is kind of a big deal and the stakes are kind of high. And when there is misinformation and bad books out there, right, it does affect people. Dave, you have come on the show many, many times, but can you still introduce yourself before we break into it?
Absolutely. Hello, I am Dave, also known as the Amateur Magus on my YouTube channel. I talk about ceremonial magic through a more mechanical lens, and I usually reference old grimoires. We're not talking about old grimoires today, though. And in fact, I ended up asking you for homework for this episode, which was always funny. But yeah, I believe we're talking about the decline of occult publishing, and specifically, like, there are so many books that don't need to be published. So many. And
Oh yeah. Dave pretty much only reads like old occult books because most of the time the old occult books are better. Now, to be clear, we are talking about the decline of occult publishing, but there are some genuinely good books coming out now. Okay, they are often from very niche publishers and are hard to get and are not available in bookstores in person, but you can get them online. Looking for those sort of more fringe publishers and the few occult shops in the U.S. who sell online who sell those books, you can get good new material. So it's not that the entire field is terrible, but I will say the ones that are published by the larger publishers, especially ones that are published by non-occult publishers, because there are mainstream publishers releasing occult books, tend to be pretty low quality. And so I actually had Dave, in preparation for this, I gave him a little bit of a reading list, some homework to basically read through. Now, I don't know if he read through the whole books of them, but to at least read sections of quite a few. And we're talking 2024 releases, okay? We were going very, very recent, most recent releases. And I had Dave also look through the catalogs of most of the mainstream publishers to see what's come out in the past year. Anyone can do this homework themselves right now, by going on, looking this stuff up or stepping into a Barnes and Noble into the ever shrinking mind, body, and spirit section and seeing what's going on. And what was your first impression from the homework that I gave you?
so I'm going to just clarify that I did not go ahead and read the entirety of these books because I ended up needing to read something older that I have not read as a palate cleanser. But what ended up happening was I ended up doing a basic trick that I do for seeing if any book is worth reading. And you at home can do the same thing. What you do is you don't read the intro, you don't read the first couple of chapters, you open to a chapter in the middle. And if it seems worth continuing, then you start from the beginning. And I did this with about 6 or 7 books And all of them I thought were absolutely, I would never recommend this, and I feel like I could have gotten better information out of books that I've already read, which is not a good sign considering that these were all from 2024. And that makes me quite sad that if you're walking into a new bookstore or a new anything and you're going to grab a book on occultism or esotericism, it's possible that these are the kind of quality you're going to be receiving. Um, and all of the books I enjoyed, I didn't know this at the time, were republishings. So they were second editions or like reprints where they did a second publishing or printing run of the books from like 10, 20 years ago. All of the ones that I enjoyed. And I was kind of taken aback by that
I
because I
think.
didn't realize this until accident.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was like, you were telling me one you liked, and I'm like, that one's from the '90s. But I would say I actually think, and I'm going on a lot. I'm gonna give a lot of hot takes today. Because the truth is, most online occult bloggers do not talk about this because they're worried about getting blacklisted. They are worried about being taken off press list. They're worried about upsetting other people. There's very much a culture of silence. Like I used to run in like the witch talk circles when those existed, and I remember I was sent quite a few books to review, and I was told by all the other creators who I was talking to at the time that if you dislike a book, what you do is you don't post about it. So only give positive reviews of what you like. And if you dislike something, don't lie about it, but simply don't post. And yeah, I was told pretty much to do this. And of course, like when you're in a social circle with a lot of people, right? You don't they fear monger you, right? Like I was told like this could really affect your reputation, it could affect possibilities, and a lot of these people want to get their own books out, and so they don't ever want to give a negative review or say anything critical of the books. And so really you've got a culture of fear to some extent, right? Because also you don't want to make enemies in a small community. um and so I think that's part of the problem, is that you just a lot of occult bloggers who are the people are looking to for reviews, um, feel that if it's not good, they shouldn't talk, and that is something I don't know if that's even public information. I don't know if anyone's even shared that. I mean, maybe, but that's crazy, and I think that cannot be making publishing better because people, reviews are important within the publishing industry, because you need to be able to give your opinions on things, and you simply cannot do that in the occult sphere if you have any sort of investment in the community.
And it doesn't help that if you're going to be reviewing a book in a negative light, you generally, no one wants to do a review about something that they have no emotions about. So if you do have negative emotions about something, those emotions are as strong as a positive review, right? That's
Yeah.
something that we don't often talk about is if you passionately hate a book, the reason why you want to talk about it is because it made you feel so negatively about the topic or the various different things in the book that you actually want to share those and kind of warn people away from that. But of course, no one wants to have their books be, negatively reviewed because that means you did a bad job, right? Even when I don't do I don't do book reviews on my channel very often. I don't do book reviews very often at all. But usually when I do book reviews, I try to say every negative, I try to front load those with all of the things I find negative so I can just talk about the positive because there is always negative and positives to every book. The problem that I think we're specifically talking about here is you're not allowed to review a book at all if you have more negative thoughts than you have positive, right? That's
Yeah.
the big issue.
Yeah, you're told by the other people you're around. I don't do book reviews at all. I did some forever ago, but I didn't like this essentially policy of the community. And also, I don't want to be in drama with people all the time because people in this community take things very, very personally. But yeah, I don't do book reviews for this reason. I occasionally release like favorites list, but I don't want to get involved in it. And if I feel this way, the people who are doing reviews, they are obligated to only say positive things at risk of people in the community attacking them getting banned from doing speaking events, them getting removed from press lists. And if you're reviewing books as your main YouTube concept, right? You need books coming in very frequently. And so you want to be on those press lists where they send you the books for free so you don't have, high expenses for your work. So yeah, I mean, they essentially can't. These people are frozen. And, when we're talking about a spiritual community, of course, like there's actual spiritual risk of pissing a lot of people off, right? And it's quite sad because I really wish we could have these critical conversations about books. They are being had on like forums sometimes, like Goodreads, I know, is obviously not people who are, they're not putting their name attached to it, so you can get more honesty there. But I don't know. It's very unfortunate because a community without critique is not going to grow, right? Like you need to have conversations about things. And because of this, the actual quality is getting bad. And nobody wants to say this. When Dave and I were having the conversation that led me to want to make this, I was basically like, let's burn it all down. Let's say what people don't want to say. This is fiery because nobody wants to say this out loud for all of these reasons. And it creates like a avalanche effect, right? Where it's causing the whole industry to suffer. And there are horrible practices going on in occult publishing right now that people are too scared to talk about for the same reason. Dave, have you heard about the algorithm books?
No, I haven't heard about the algorithm. What is an algorithm book? Is that like AI occult books? Is that what's going on?
So this was happening about 3 years ago. So I'm sure they're doing it with AI now. But about 3 years ago, what they were doing is they were a lot of whole publishers do this. By the way, I think one of them. You know what? I'm going to name one publisher because I really don't care about these people. I believe it was called. I'm not going to name it because I don't want to get this wrong. It started with an R. I don't want to say the wrong name because that would actually be very misleading of me. But there is one whole publisher that was approaching a lot of like witchy influencers. Not one of the old well-known publishers. It was just like a new one that was popping up where they basically would go up to people. And I actually saw an influencer I was friends with actually showed me what they were sent when they were given this offer. I believe they didn't go through with it, but they were sent basically like a Mad Lib to fill in. So an algorithm basically took a bunch of keywords from what was popular on social media and brought it all together and created essentially a like really detailed outline that you would fill in. It's also probably good I'm not saying the publisher name now that I've given that detail. But basically, yes, like they were given an outline with like what to like put on each page, and then like they had to write the paragraphs to fill it in, just based on trends. And I think we can think for a moment how that is not conductive to good literature. Now that AI is out, right? I'm sure they're doing this with AI, right? This was kind of like a proto AI thing. So I'm sure now it's way more advanced. But yes, these books were getting published. People were putting their names on them. And because these are other people that you're your colleagues essentially doing this, I mean, you can't say anything, right? You're told not to say anything. And also like the reason why I'm not naming that publisher is I don't want to get in any sort of like litigation trouble. I think this is considered like pretty secret. There are, of course, actual like literary news like websites that have discussed algorithm books. Like I am not pulling this out of my ass, but I know during the witch talk boom, this was happening. Now I don't know if they're still doing this because there's not as much money in witchcraft and occult publishing as there was a couple years ago. There was a big boom in 2020, 2021, and that has really fizzled down. So this could be happening at a much smaller scale, but I know it was happening at a decent scale a couple years ago, which is just horrible.
Wow. Okay, that actually explains something. So when I was doing my homework for this video, or this episode, whatever we're calling it, so one of the things I noticed, other than the big one, which was, do we seriously need more beginner tarot books? Please. There was like 6 of them that I saw. One of the big things I noticed was even the books that I was like, okay, this is kind of interesting. I thought to myself, I'm never going to remember this book. I am never going to remember this because it has nothing to actually say. I'm very much a big fan of the concept of creative works having a soul to them. You know, if you are going to be making esoteric and spiritual related books, they should, I'm not going to say divinely inspired, but you should have some actual like desire to create them for the sake of creating art, right? Or actually transmitting information in a way that will actually be well received by your targeted audience. When you do this kind of algorithmic, AI based writing style in general, it sucks all of the soul out of it and replaces it with an artificial core, so to speak. I absolutely hate AI. I recently put out a video about Mercury and how awful the planetary power of Mercury can be, and this is why. It's just generally taking the absolute most mechanized methods and applying it to spirituality so that we don't need to actually come up with an actual outline and actually think about what we want to say as writers. We can just have a robot or a computer do it, and then we can just fill in the blanks. I absolutely abhor this. I absolutely hate this. And if that is half of what I was reading, that makes so much sense. It's not even funny.
Yeah, I don't think it's like half. I think this is like a specific percentage. I mean, I would probably guess 10 to 15. I do think probably the more mainstream stuff, the stuff that's not like literal like AI stuff, because to be clear, those are being released by non-occult publishers, to my knowledge, right? Maybe the occult publishers started doing the algorithm method, but at the time it was non-occult publishers like venturing into the occult who were doing the algorithm stuff. But the rest of it, I am pretty sure people are being, told to write specific things for what people will read, which I mean, I understand to some extent, right? If you are a occult publishing house, right, you're probably not a huge business and you need people to buy your books, and it is safer to have someone write something that's beginner oriented, been seen a million times, you know it will sell, than something divinely inspired. But the problem with that is all the occult books that these books cite are divinely inspired. There's this thing actually that was really bothering me a while ago, where basically it was on TikTok, the playground of gnosis, where people were saying that they didn't like a lot of these old Wicca books from the 90s because they don't have enough sources in them, and they're people who just like made things up. And I'm like, well, there's some legitimate problems with these books. I mean, they're not my favorite books, right? 90s Wicca books are not like my number one genre. But I will give them this. They are what a lot of modern occult books are pulling from, and they were based on people's actual ritual experiences, right? Like the way those books are written were people picking up Wicca and taking British traditional Wicca and turning it into a more eclectic tradition and creating a tradition that many, many people follow. And so, yeah, people were kind of quote unquote making things up based on their own religious experiences, but that's kind of all of metaphysical publishing. And I feel like I'm kind of like shattering something for people, because I think people are trying to see metaphysical publishing through the lenses of like either not academia proper, but like the way people think academia works, like if you're like an undergraduate student, or through the lens of like it's a nonfiction book, so it should be written like a scientific paper, which no, because all of these books are citing people's religious experiences, all right? All these famous occult books that we look at, like the Keys of Solomon, right? Solomon made that shit up, okay? But does that mean it's not divinely inspired? No, he made it up based on his religious experiences. Now, if someone was writing a book where they were just like making crap up that had nothing to do with their rituals, like that would be bad. But I think there's this like weird obsession with validation where it's like you have to constantly be citing, like you're writing an MLA format paper for your AP literature class. And I don't think that's conductive to creating new material, because what happens is the good occult books that come out now, excluding specific outliers, I will say there are some great outliers. I have posted online about my favorite recent releases several times. I'm probably going to before this episode comes out to make it clear that I'm not just a hater. A lot of those are not constantly citing things. A lot of those are based on people's personal experiences. Like one of my favorite, more modern occult books, I'm gonna name this one Holy Daemon, right? That book's incredible. That is based off someone's specific way of getting their holy daemon, right? It is not like, oh, well, you get what I'm saying? Like there's this thing that they want things to be written in a way that doesn't really make sense and doesn't fit the genre of metaphysical writing, right? If you are saying like in Thelema this exists, right? Yes, you should be citing things. But if we want new material we need to be considering people's actual spiritual revelations and getting that out. Because all of religious writing is this, right? It's all people making things up of their experiences. That's kind of all of human knowledge if you want to get technical with it. But yeah, that's my little one of my theories on this conversation.
I would definitely say that there is a bit of a publication bias or like a publication fallacy, I would say, going on in spirituality that really doesn't need to exist. Because one of the problems that you'll find is that just because a book, if a book has like 5,000 citations, right? That doesn't mean it's actually good. That just means it has 5,000 citations. The actual book could be completely terrible. Now, there's, of course, books that have a million citations and they are fantastic. But the problem with that is you're not actually looking at the book itself if you're just looking at what it's citing. You are looking for more books to read afterwards, because if this book you liked is citing sources, you now have 30 other books you can go grab that are older that you can actually go read and get better results with if you include all of those in your newfound understanding based on the original book, right? That's part of the reason why that is part of the reason why I don't cite sources on my channel. It's because there's a specific kind of occultist and there's a specific kind of person in the spiritual community that only really likes books to put on their shelf. They are, I call them knowledge hounds. They're the kind of people who go ahead and they just buy up a bunch of books because they're recommended, regardless of quality. And because they don't have the experience fully, or they're still developing their spiritual practices, they don't end up being able to fully judge the books that they're reading because they don't have the experience to verify if this is a good book or bad book, right? That's kind of a problem. I think that that's probably one of the biggest issues. And one of the things I think no one talks about is the longer you get into spirituality, the more you're going to rely on books less, unless you are specifically trying to be coming at your spirituality from a scholarly perspective. Most of the time, when you get to a certain point in spirituality, you are going to be you're going to be contacting spirits, if you believe in the spirit paradigm, which I do. You're going to be contacting spirits and you're going to have spiritual experiences, and those spiritual experiences are going to inform your spirituality. And at some point, you're going to be putting the books down. You're just going to do that. That's not really an issue at that point, but before that, you need the books to kind of kickstart your spiritual journey, which is why all of the beginner occult books are kind of a problem. Because you start out with all of the beginner books, and there's no intermediate, and you have to kind of find your way, and then eventually you get to a point where there is no advanced books at all, and you just kind of have to drop books entirely, which is kind of sad. I would prefer if there was more books, like, more advanced books.
I kind of agree with you and kind of don't, actually. I'm going to push back slightly. I think it's not that you need to drop books entirely, because I still read books. I think the better way to see it is to realize you're niching out the further
Mm,
you go, and you're going to be less dependent on books for forming your practice the further you go, right? Because when you're new, right, you're completely dependent on teachings, right? You haven't had any personal gnosis to guide you. But I
absolutely.
think, and because I know you also still read, I think what happens is it just gets very niche and very specific, to the point where what you're researching is kind of out of the realm of like what a beginner occult book is. Like, if you look at like really the books that I would say are actually classed in like the higher categories, though there are very few books that are not beginner books. There are very few intermediate and advanced books. The ones that I would say actually do fit that criterion are niche and specific, right? Like they are about like planet, like the lunar mansions, right? Like I've actually been reading through the Shams al Marif, the untranslated version for forever, because I am an English speaker, so that's taking me 9 years. Um, but when I look into that, which is it's an older and it is a very advanced book, it gets really niche and specific, right? I know people who become like traditional witches and they start with those like beginner traditional witchcraft books. And by the time they're far along, they're actually reading a lot of stuff on like plant medicine, right? And like botany and all of this. And that's actually spiritual material for them. but they've gotten so niche that it's gotten kind of out of the scope. Because I think we are always constantly referencing things, and I think there is a lot of value to looking back at like occult books you've already read, specifically ones that are divinely inspired or channeled. But what happens is the thing that you are completely on the hitting the nail on the head with is you become way less reliant on them, right? Like the way you structure ritual by the time you're advanced or intermediate even, you have a specific way you operate, right? Like people get into habits, right? There's a specific way I format my rituals. There's a specific way I do my rituals, right? No matter what I'm doing, you develop tendencies and you develop spirits that you work with the most, right? You're not trying to like add 9 million spirits to what you're doing. You probably don't want to branch out and start a whole new tradition, right? So it just gets really specific is what I think happens. And when you are in the knowledge hound phase, which I totally was a knowledge hound when I was new, by the way, like I was absolutely me. um you have no direction, right? Once you have direction, this is where you start running out of things to read really fast. If you are new and you don't know what you want to do, like I think it's overwhelming because the advanced books are hard to get. They're annoying. You have to track them down. It's a lot of work. But when you're new, like there's 9 million beginner books, right? Like you could go on the website ever and probably read. They probably have, like thousands for like $6 subscription. I mean, you could read endless beginner occult books. You could go into your public library, find them. The mind, body, spirit section, though I actually think the mind, body, spirit section is even stocking good stuff, even by modern occult book standards. But yeah, like you're just overwhelmed. It's endless. And then once you start niching out, you're like, okay, this is weird. I can't read at the same rate I was before. I don't know where to go next. Like it's it's a very weird shift that happens.
Right. I absolutely was being hyperbolic. I mean, even I mentioned I was doing a palate cleanser. The book that I was reading as a palate cleanser was actually the Azoatia by Chumbley, as the palate cleanser, which, no, I've never read that, but it's incredibly dense. But the thing about it is, yes, there are more niche topics. The big problem is, the big problem I have, and I've had this for a while, is that there is no intermediary step
No, none at all.
between getting to those niche books and the beginner work, right? You start out and you have a million and one choices. Even if you don't, even if you're not interested in like 90% of them, let's say you're like a really hardcore, you already know what you want, which is that's how you can tell this is hypothetical, because no one knows what they want when they first start. Maybe you want to be only involved in ceremonial magic, and you don't even know what ceremonial magic fully is, right? You have major different books that you can read. You could read Crowley, you could read up on the Golden Dawn. If you're really interesting, you want to read up on the Aurum Solus, you can read up on all of these. But from beginning there's not really a way to get into like, okay, I do extremely specific talismanic magic using only these sources, right? Those sources do exist, but they're incredibly hard to come by. Like you mentioned the Green Witch plant magic works that you in the previous example. One of the things I've been reading, I've been really looking into talismanic magic. And so part of my occult work has been studying the properties of metals, which has not only informed my spiritual practice, but has also shaped how I view the planetary powers in a weird way, because it ends up teaching you a lot about the different ways that the planets work if you end up adding a physical component to it, which is what the ancients were doing. So that's part of what I've been doing as magical work. But when it comes to those intermediary steps, if I told you to go read a book on metals and you don't understand why, and I don't tell you it's for talismanic magic, you're not going to do that.
Yeah, you're gonna think it's completely irrelevant. Like, to understand a lot about like incenses you use, right? Or oils you use. I use a lot of incenses and oils. I don't use a lot of tools outside of those, except like the basic ritual tools I use for everything. I don't use 9 million tools, but I use a lot of like scent as a correspondence. Now, if I want to learn about that, if I were to recommend someone, I'm like, well, learning a bit about like how scent works is quite helpful, or what fragrance is quite helpful. Like if you want to make your own ritual oils, you should learn a little bit about like perfumery, right? that is completely irrelevant to someone who's new, right? They need to learn like the literal correspondences, right? They need to get a correspondence book and flip through that. Correspondence books are great to read, but the problem is you can't really read them. They're more like reference books. I mean, I guess you can read them. So even recommendations like that are hard, right? Because that intermediate phase is really important. And I think that's where a lot of people get lost, honestly, because, you've made it past beginner books. I talk to a lot of people in this phase, actually, right? They've made it past beginner books, and they're going to the mind, body, spirit section, and every single book feels like the same book. This is how it was for me when I was new, right? I was being driven insane because every single book I read on paganism felt like I was reading the same book again. And when I was new to being a content creator and I was being sent books, a lot of them I was like, I'm reading the same book again. It felt kind of mind numbing, honestly. And so I was like, oh, I want to read something different. And then, like, yeah, you, like Dave, like you grab the Azoatia, right? You're like, oh, this is a hard book. And then you're like, I have absolutely no clue what's going on, right? That middle phase, I think people should be writing books in the middle phase. People listening to this who are writers, please write those. I want more of them because I have people come to me for spiritual advice all the time who are like, okay, so I know I'm not a beginner. I've done like a bunch of rituals, but I don't know my true will. I don't know what my path is. I don't know how to contact my HGA. The Obermelon seems really overwhelming. Should I seek out mentorship? Should I join a group? Like, there's a lot of questions people ask you when they're in this phase, and I often point them to community. I think community is a good bridge in this phase, but community shouldn't have to be the only bridge. And depending on where you live, community is not always an option, or is not a high quality option, or is not in alignment with the path you're on at all. Like if you live in some, more niche area and the only thing around you is like an True group and a Wicca group, and you're a Thelemite and you're in this phase, like that's not very helpful advice, is that? Um, so it's just it's tricky. And I think at that stage, I mean, now it's kind of just people have to experiment in that phase, honestly. But I do wish people in that phase had more resources because a lot of people are getting there, right? There seems to be some myth that permeates occult publishing that like the only books people want to read are beginner books. There's only beginners. And that's not true because also, if you're only selling beginner books, people aren't buying beginner books for forever, right? Most people are not buying like beginner witch books for like over a decade, right? They're buying those for a couple of years.
So
How,
my
like, it doesn't even make sense for market, I think. Like literally financially, which is the reason why they only release beginner books in my opinion. It doesn't even make sense.
So I have a theory about this. I think that the excessive amount of beginner occult books have caused people to stop buying them because they don't need them anymore. All of the beginner occult books that we ever need have been overprinted, and we need the more intermediate books, which are those older books that keep getting reprinted, right? Those books that keep getting reprinted, like we're on what, version 9 of Regardi's Black Brick, which is now purple. Apparently it's purple now. But we do need those, like, I've been saying this for years. There needs to be something, and I'm coming at this from a ceremonial magic perspective. The book that I recommend people on ceremonial magic, you get through it. It takes you all the way through the beginning. It lays out where you should be going from step 1 to like the intermediate steps, and then it gets to the intermediate steps and it goes, you should know what to do what from here. If you don't know what to do, I guess like read this or go get your holy guardian angel. Have fun. The reins are off. Go do whatever you want now. There is no real thing for ceremonial magic, at least, of I am at the point where I'm right before I should be getting my holy guardian angel, but not quite there yet. What do I do in between there, right? And I know for me that answer was astrology. I do a lot of astrology. I have very strong opinions about astrology. There's several rants on my channel about it. But when it comes down to those, you don't need to have like 30 books on astrology. In fact, I've read 30 books on astrology, it feels like, and most of them say the same thing. So you will be kind of circling the wagons if you keep republishing the same kind of material. And eventually, your audience, if you are an occult publisher, is going to be like, okay, cool. I feel like I've read this about 3 times. Do you have anything else? And that's why we end up going back to older sources. Recently, there's been a big movement in the occult, it seems, of a grimoire revival movement, which is going back to those old grimoires that are citing no sources. They are completely practice oriented, and they are going through and they're citing really obscure sources that we usually don't even have anymore. So we're just judging the quality of the works from one, the scholarly translations, which honestly the biggest category of occult books that I've been buying recently has been new translations that are much higher quality. And those translations and the material in the actual work, right? Because a lot of these older practices that we have, like, the Golden Dawn was basing off of Barrett's The Magus, and all of those sources were basing off of Agrippa, and we're getting new translations off of those core fundamental texts in ceremonial magic. But we don't have. We're going back to the original books as kind of a stopgap for not having any intermediate material. And if we just wrote the intermediate material, we wouldn't have to do this as much. It would be, it would be those more advanced texts that's like, yes, you've read the intermediate material. Here's where it comes from. See what the intermediate material left out. That would ideally be what we're doing. But instead, we're just cutting out the intermediate writers entirely, and we're just going straight to, yeah, here's the original source texts in a new translation. Have fun.
Well, the translations also vary radically. Like, I've read different translations of the Picatrix, and whether you get a translation that's called the Picatrix or the Gayat al-Hakim, even ones that are called like Picatrix / Gayat al-Hakim, different material entirely. Like, they are really different, depending on which version of the Picatrix, the same text, because it's whether it's translated directly from Arabic or translated from the Latin translation of the Arabic, right? For a long time, we really only had like the Latin translation of the Arabic, then translated to English, right?
Yep.
It changes it a lot, right? Like how Islamic it is even varies in interesting ways. And when we look at even more niche texts, like I have talked a lot about the Shams al-Marif, there is only one English translation of the Shams al-Marif, and it is a selected translation. That is because the full Shams al-Marif is, and I have the whole series, 4 500-page bricks, right? And so when someone was going to translate that to English, it's translated fully into Urdu and Turkish, and of course it's in Arabic. When someone went to put it in English, they just did a selected translation of basically like the highlights of all those books. And I will be real, as someone who's now reading through the whole thing, I actually do think the highlights are well chosen. It's a good translation. But of course, nobody wants to translate like 2,000 pages of material. That would take, I don't even know how many years that would take. It'd take a very long time. And so when you get texts like that, like Shams al-Marif, like you're getting only probably what, like 20%, 10% of the entire thing. And I'm praising that translation, so I feel comfortable mentioning it. But yeah, I mean, it's limited, and I mean, most people don't want to study a foreign language to get the source text. Now, you can do that. That's quite impressive if you do, and commendable. I would recommend doing that. But of course, that's, not everyone's going to do that. And actually, I was comparing modern beginner occult books. This was an interesting intellectual exercise to Crowley's beginner recommendations. Because Crowley did actually create a student curriculum of books to read for people who are taking a student degree in one of his orders. And I just like to list off what Crowley has decided are beginner books, and then we'll compare it to modern books. He's
I'm
listed
excited for
12
this.
books. The Equinox, Volume 1, numbers 1 to 10. So that's 10 copies of the Equinox.
Okay, that's already a lot. Keep going.
777 by Crowley. I like him recommending his own book.
Wait, are these just is he just self-advertising right now? Is that what they say?
Like half the list is him. Some of it's not, but I do think that's kind of like ascended. It's just say my books are the beginner books. These are also like, most people do not consider these beginner books, okay?
These are not beginner books for most people, but keep going.
Nox on Pox by Crowley.
Okay.
The collected works of Aleister Crowley. So that's like, I think what's in that is like Book of the Law and some other stuff.
Yeah,
like I don't know exactly what's in that collection. Raja Yoga by Swami Vivekananda.
Okay. It's kind of interesting.
The Hatha Yoga Pradipika.
Okay, so we got to his yoga section because he does do a lot of yoga stuff, I think, right?
Yeah. The Tao Te Ching, which is the weird thelemic Tao Te Ching rewrite of sorts.
Tao Te Ching is pretty great, honestly.
They've got their own version. This is like the really wild thelemic rewrite.
Okay.
The Spiritual Guide by Miguel de Molinos. I actually don't even know that one.
I don't know what that one is either.
They've got the Eliphas Levi. He wrote the title of his book in French for some fucking reason, but we all
Eliphas
know.
Levi was French.
Well, he could have written the title in English on his English recommendation lists. A
Oh, he
little
should have.
pretentious, really. Dogme et rituel de la Roi Magie. We know what book that is. Okay, the Goetia. I love it. Based Crowley just saying the Goetia is a beginner book. TikTok approves of that take. The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin and the Mage, the Mathers version, and the Book of Lies by Crowley. So this is his 12 beginner book recommendations, which compared to modern occult books is like a crazy list. Like before,
You had me until the last three.
when I was a new YouTuber, I made like a beginner books list, and I put like the 3 books of occult philosophy. People were like, "That's not a beginner book. Shut the fuck up." Anyone who attacked me needs to read Crowley's list and say I'm much more charitable, because this is actually like a hard list. Like, especially Noxum Pox, some parts of the Equinox. A lot of these are actually, like, I would say pretty high, and I'm gonna say some of these are like pretty deep into intermediate territory. And Goetia as a beginner book is like a good fun choice there, because I would definitely not call the Goetia a beginner book, but a lot of beginners do read it. I mean, you can read it as a beginner. I don't think you should like practice it immediately.
I think I actively say to stay away from that as a beginner.
I think people can read it. I just don't think we should use it. So this is, I will be clear, by modern standards, an absolutely crazy beginner read. He also says you can read this in about 3 months. That's his timeline for your reading route for this. But yeah, that's an intense list as a beginner book list, and I think most people, if I were to post that no context and not say Aleister Crowley wrote that list, I think people would bully me for saying this is my beginner book list. Because I actually do think it is too advanced to be beginner books, but I think it's not as unreasonable as I think some people make it out to be. Do you get what I'm saying?
I mean, as long as you're not saying to like do everything in these books, I think that list is genuinely like a pretty good, like, here's the knowledge you will require. I feel like the funny thing is we do have actually like improved versions of a lot of the stuff on there. Like, I know most people will not read Crowley's spreadsheet anymore. Sorry, Aleister Crowley fans. Most people I know are going to Stephen Skinner's Complete Magician's Tables, which Stephen Skinner is pretty great, and I use that book constantly as my reference book of choice. But for the most part, as long as you're not actually like practicing out of those books and you're just being like, all right, here is all of the occult information you need to read, I would think that that's genuinely a pretty good list. It introduces you to a lot of topics you're not really going to be expecting.
Yeah, I will say the Equinox, there's a lot in the Equinox you can skip that is not like important information. There's like a lot of like poetry and short stories. They are fun, but definitely look for like nowadays there's a book called The Gems of the Equinox. People have like collected the most important parts of the Equinox and put it into a giant brick of a book. So that might be good if you are interested in reading this list. But when we look at like what people release now as like beginner book list, right? In comparison, I'm not going to pull up anyone's specific list because that would be kind of horrible and I don't want to attack anyone. But if we are to compare, there is going to be a big gap, right? Because I constantly see people saying that they want essentially a lot of books dumbed down, and then you read the dumbed down version and that's so what next. And I think there's a lot of like crap coming out that I don't even know if it's written by occultists. Sometimes I'm even skeptical of that. I know there was a scandal that was never released to the public, but was internal amongst like the witch talk people, of one girl was like a secret like Protestant Christian who was publishing witch books, but she was like secretly a Protestant. I don't think they ever released that information, but I know that was a big internal kerfuffle. But yeah, I mean, it's just there's a lot that's just not good, and I think we should give people like books that are not, you should probably not read like the Equinox or 777 as your first book. Like Crowley's a little overambitious with that one, but I think you can read them sooner than I think people think. And I think if you are stuck on the endless merry-go-round of modern occult books and what's being released, you're gonna never get to that point. Do you get what I'm saying? You need to step off the carousel at some point.
And there is one thing, you will exchange the tones of the modern beginner occult books for posh British if you do this. One of the things I noticed in my very outsider looking in view of modern occult publishing was I felt like I was being condescended to a lot. It
Oh,
was
I
weird.
hate the popular writing style. It's very, very casual. And I don't even mind things that are kind of casual. Like I and you, I don't think should be banned. In older occult books, you never see like the I and you tenses. Now I do think they have a place. I don't hate them. But what I do hate is when it is written, and you described it as a journal entry. I
Yes.
hate that. I think it's too casual. And I don't think we need necessarily like that old posh British style of writing, though I do actually like it. It appeals to me in a way. Um I think that there's a middle zone between that and like literally writing like there's like rants in some of these books that are so irrelevant. Like I do not care when I'm reading a book on like I don't know, Enochian magic, I really don't care about your personal life very much. If you want to talk about your personal life, if it's not directly relevant to the text, like I mean literally directly relevant. Like you are describing a ritual you did that you were giving instructions for, level relevant. Keep that in the introduction, the preface, or like an outro. I really don't think it should be intermingled with the entire text. And what happens is, like, I was reading a new occult book actually on Everand the other day, and I was quite annoyed because I was skipping half the text. Like probably 50% of the book. I actually almost do not finished it. This book is like one of probably the reason why we're doing this podcast. Because I actually wanted the information in it. Like I was on a topic, I was researching for a video, and I was like, okay, there's a recent book on this topic. I'm really annoyed looking around at different sources. Maybe there's just one book that covers what I'm looking at, right? That's the book title and the subject was exactly what I was looking for. And I started reading it, and it was like a lot about this person's personal life and their relationships and all this that is irrelevant to this was about a topic, right? Like I thought it was an educational book about a specific topic, and I was reading it and I was frustrated. I was repeatedly frustrated. And so I ended up skimming. There was like probably 50% of the book that was usable and relevant. And that grates on you when it's like 200 pages. I was like, is this person trying to hit a page limit or something? Because it kills the vibe of the book. I think you can use a little bit of personal narrative, eyes and yous, in ways that add to the text, but it should not be a distraction. And I think a lot of modern occult books, it's an absolute distraction. Like some of these books almost feel like memoirs. And unless you are writing a memoir on your magical experiences, if you're some famous occultist who has done amazing rituals in their life, I just don't care. And I don't think most people care. And maybe that's harsh, but
So the first occult book I ever received in paper was given to me, and would you believe me if I told you that it literally had a 11-page photograph spread in the center of the book to detail the author's trip to visit the crystal skulls in South America?
I believe it. I believe
And
it.
And let me tell you, the topic that the book was written about, I'm not going to say the name of the book despite the fact that I'm looking right at it. This was from like 2009, roughly, when the Crystal Skulls were all the rage. But the book in question had nothing to do with that. And at the end of the book, it gave one ritual that is actually 30. That probably gives away what kind of magic it was actually about. Um, so when I say that these books are a little bit too personal, that's what I'm using as a baseline. But when I'm reading the newer books, I can't help but feel like I'm accidentally opening a book of like an occult Dear Abby, right? That's how it feels a lot of times. Like when I would go through and it's like, yes, you can do this particular thing, or the fool means this, or like this is a particularly difficult aspect of witchcraft, and it's talking about like basic candle stuff that is so basic that most people should be able to figure it out in like 5 minutes of reading a good book. And the problem is that there are good beginner occult books that are being published. It's just that you now have to find them they are a diamond in the rough, and you need to go through a lot in order to find what is actually good. And I think that's the biggest problem that I personally have, at least, with the entire system.
Yeah, because there is good material. There are some books that came out in the past in 2024 that were very good, but the majority were trash. And um, the thing you were talking about with the writing style is it feels dumbed down in a lot of ways, and I don't mind people who don't write in an overly gatekeepy writing style. I don't even actually, I'm not going to use the term gatekeepy because I don't like that phrasing. A lot of people claim that occult books that are written in metaphysical quality writing, where they use big words and they use metaphysical jargon and all of this, are like gatekeepy inherently, and I disagree. When you learn about a subject matter, you learn the jargon. That just means you need to study more. Um, or unaccessible or all of this. Like, and I think people have run with that logic. And so now when people are writing occult books, they're like, oh, I have to be as accessible as possible. And so I'm going to write like I'm writing for middle schoolers. Like it's young adult style writing. If you go into the nonfiction section of the bookstore, which is where occult books are shelved, and you open a book in the history section, right? There's 9 million books on the Civil War and World War II in every single bookstore you go into. And if you open a random one of those and turn to the page, it is written in quality writing. That book is sold to the normies, okay? Non-historians read those books all the time. I'm sure we all know some guy who is really into like history and reads those books. Why can we not have that style of writing where it is intellectual writing, but it's not to the point where like you need a PhD to understand it? And I actually think books where you need a PhD to understand it within the occult category, that level of intellectual rigor needs to exist as well, because what's happened is the bar has gotten so low that people think for something to be accessible, it has to be really dumbed down for like children. It's young adult writing, and I think that is ridiculous because it's like mocking your reader. It's actually kind of offensive in a sense, because anyone who's intelligent enough to commune with spirits is intelligent enough to read something that's not a 300-page book on how to do candle spells, right? And if someone wants to write a really good 300 book on candle spells and go into like effigies and talismans and all sorts of things and how to create the candles yourself or whatever, then that I would say maybe justifies that. But for a beginner book where you're just buying candles and burning them, that does not need to be a full book, right? Um
Generally speaking, I'd agree with that. Yeah. There's also going back to your topic, like going back to that for a second. Um I a lot of my practice is influenced by Agrippa, and at the beginning of, I believe it's either book 1 or he does it again at the end of book 3, I know that. He basically says my writing is intentionally dense to weed out people who don't deserve to know what it means. And if you don't know what it means, you weren't meant to know it. The we talk about esoteric topics, and the occult literally means hidden. And oftentimes, what will happen is if you go back and read older texts, they're not actually that difficult. The problem is that one paragraph will have about 3 pages worth of information just due to the vocabulary used, right? That's the problem I was having with the Azoatia, and the reason I originally didn't read it, because you need to reread like every page like 6 times to understand what he's talking about. Now, we're obviously not saying that that should be the level of density that your writing should have. We're not saying that all books should be, you know, Azoatia level dense, but they don't need to be holding your hands level of accessible. There should be a little bit of friction to reading them, because if the historical texts about World War II are more difficult to read than the witchcraft books, that kind of makes everyone look bad. Like, that kind of makes all spiritual books look bad if it looks like they're written for, like, young adults, right? It makes it look like it's a phase instead of a actually, a serious spiritual tradition and discipline that we should be trying to cultivate. It just kind of doesn't work right. I don't know.
I also think there's a case for wanting to raise yourself to the material you want to read. I think that people are afraid of growth, but all of spirituality is about growth. I think if there is a specific occult text you want to read and it does go over your head or partially goes over your head, that's not a personal failure. I think people think this is like some attack on them, but it's actually a call for you to improve and to learn more, right? You can, like, there are some occult texts that I read really early on, made absolutely no sense to me, and I've reread them years later and they made sense because I took the time to study. You can get yourself to the level where the Azoatia, the Book of the Law, all these books make sense to you, right? You just need to study. It is fine to go, okay, well, this is where the bar is. I'm going to bring myself to the bar, right? That is actually valuable because when we look at the people, like let's be honest about the people who were writing the older books, right? What is their background, right? Well, let's consider this. These were mostly very educated men who had a background in I mean, if you look at like Dee and whatnot, like these are people who are part of like the royal elite. They presumably had a background in academia. They were intellectuals. Like Crowley had a heavy academia background. And these people were well studied, right? They spoke multiple languages. They were very well read on philosophy, literature, all these things. And these are noble pursuits that you can do in your own house, right? As you are learning about occultism, ceremonial magic in your own house and doing it yourself, right? Because, of course, in the old days, you'd have to join an order. Now you don't have to do that. You can learn all these subjects yourself, right? The information age is here. Everything has been democratized. You can access all these materials these people were reading, especially because of the way public domain works. You can go on your computer and without violating any copyright laws, read the text that Crowley was studying that he would have read before creating these materials. You can teach yourself these languages. You can do a lot of self-teaching to get to the point where these very dense materials make a lot of sense to you. There is nothing holding you back from that. And I think if we are going to be mystics and strive towards the Godhead and strive towards gnosis, towards knowledge, that's what we all claim we're striving towards, I think we should be willing to challenge ourselves, right? There are things I read now that go above my head still, right? I do not know everything. There's a lot I have to learn. I don't even think I'm that far on my journey in the grand scheme of things. I'll be on this journey till I die. But if I see something that I want to understand that I don't understand less yet, I have to get there because right now those intermediate books are not there, right? There are the bottoms of the rungs of the ladder, and then there's those top rungs, and you have to kind of jump or stretch yourself, right? You have to learn the techniques to get there. Now, I would like if people would make those intermediate books, but right now we don't have them. So working with what we have, I think getting yourself to the bar is actually a very valuable use of your time. And reading things that you don't quite understand is still a worthwhile endeavor because what you can do, and this is what I do, is if I'm reading, I'm going to say Nox on Pox. Okay, that's on Crowley's beginner list, but a lot of people that goes absolutely way over their head, right? That's a hard read. If you're reading Nox on Pox, and there are sections of it that don't make sense to you, they're referencing specific books or specific traditions, you can go and read that or even read a modern explanation, like one of these beginner books on that subject, and then go back to the older text, read it, and it illuminates itself, right? You can cross-reference things. You don't need to read one book at a time. You can kind of be reading in a way that makes you one of those like schizophrenics with the red lines on your wall, right? There are ways to get there with what we have now. I would like things to change. I would like occult publishing to invest in intermediate books because I don't actually think it's profitable to only be making beginner books. I think this is literally an illogical business model. Beyond that, I think people should have intermediate books just for the sake of having them. I think it also doesn't make sense. There are ways to get there, and the esoteric societies and the people that we, want to emulate and take as our inspirations did a lot of work to get where they are, and I think we need to be willing to work. And this could be that I have some heavy Saturn placements in my chart that I'm on this rant, but I think that there is use to challenging yourself.
Not everything in the occult is meant to be accessible, and just because we go ahead and we want to make it accessible for the right people does not mean that we shouldn't be trying to strive to be better. We shouldn't be pulling a John Dee with everything that you're trying to explain being so above the heads of everyone else that they're just like, yeah, you're just crazy. You're just insane. That's actually what happened to Dr. John Dee, funny enough. But you should be going ahead and you should be striving to learn better. And one of the things is, some of your favorite books on the occult are not going to be occult books, like purely occult books. One of my favorite books on the occult is actually Sun Tzu's Art of War, which is not an occult book at all. That's more of a philosophy textbook on how to navigate conflict. But that book in and of itself, if you view it through esoteric lenses, will actually make you better at your spiritual pursuits, because you could take other things and apply it to your mundane life. And then when you go and it's like, maybe those are the keys too. Maybe those are the keys you need to unlock those higher level spiritual books that you're just not able to read right now, right? One of the practices that one of the practices I really like is go through a what is effectively a foundational text on a spiritual topic, and you go through that book, and then you come back to it years later and you do reread it. And your relationship with that book, having gone through and developed in your spiritual journey, if everything has gone well, you should have a completely different relationship to that book. My favorite version of this is Dion Fortune's Mystical Kabbalah. When I read that as a beginner, I had no idea what half of it meant. And then when I came back to it years later, after having practiced for a good long while, I understood it. You have to grow to the books that you want to read, and they will in turn help you grow and develop. So you have to be guiding yourself on your spiritual journey, but the books can help be little islands of progress, so you know that you're actually growing the way you want to grow. And maybe that's the Jupiterian in my chart.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I think that we're now in the current times, right? For most of occult history, getting into occultism was one of the most hierarchical things in the world to do. It was super gate kept. It was very hard to do. Certain traditions you had to be like related to specific people. This doesn't exist anymore thanks to the internet, mass publishing, all these things. I believe firmly every single person has a right to learn this information. Now, will every single person understand it or follow it through or do the work to get there? No, but I think everyone should have a shot to cross that gate. So I'm actually an anti-gatekeeper in the most extreme sense, despite being called a gatekeeper frequently for being opinionated. I believe everyone has a shot at knowledge. Whether they pursue it and follow it through, that's their business. But I think people should know where to get this information and then approach it themselves and teach themselves if they do not understand yet and get there. One book, since you mentioned a book outside of occultism that has really impacted your occult views, I'm going to recommend one that I think is brilliant. I've referenced it, actually, concepts from it in a lot of my videos. It is this beautiful book called The Purification of the Heart by Hamza Yusuf, who is an Islamic classicist. He is not an occultist, doesn't even call himself a Sufi to my knowledge, though a lot of Sufis like his work. It is a book on the way that spiritual affliction causes physical problems. It's a book that bridges science and spirituality. And what's brilliant about it is it talks about different conditions like envy, hatred, and how those are spiritual afflictions. And it's very, very good. I am obviously not Muslim. I am a pagan, but that book applies to miasma. It actually explains the idea of miasma, which is not elaborate. There's no real books, to my knowledge, just on miasma. That book is actually basically a book on miasma. You just have to read it and then like kind of take it and apply it to your worldview, right? There's a lot of things outside of your worldview that can be heavily applicable. And so looking outside of what you might think you might enjoy can give you a lot of insight. And that book is actually very accessible. It is not hard to read. It's not going to go over your head. It's very, very simple, honestly. But it is beautifully explains like what envy is, why many religions called envy a sin, and how it affects you, the evil eye type stuff. It's very, very good. There's a lot of books out there that will surprise you. I just picked that up at a used bookstore on a whim, and I was like, oh wait, this is like kind of a game changer.
And that concept is actually like kind of in Agrippa as well. So it is a spiritual concept. It's just taken from a very non-spiritual lens, I would say.
Yeah, it's like interesting because he says they're like spiritual in origin, but they can cause like kind of physical problems. He goes into it in a lot of very interesting angles. When I read it, it felt like a deeply spiritual book. When I look up the writer, people talk about him as like a scholar of Islamic sciences or whatever. It's a good read. It really, really is. There's a lot out there that is very good. There's a lot of material you can read and gain a lot of insight from. It's just often not beginner books, which absolutely sucks. Because good beginner books, as much as we've ragged on them, are actually very important, right? There need to be that step one book. It's just finding a good one is unfortunately very hard when that should be pretty easy. I'm asked frequently, what's the best beginner book? And I actually, I don't even know what the best answer is because there are quite a few that I can think of and be like, I like this one, I like that one. But there's a lot, right? And I think we you were talking about that earlier about people getting overwhelmed.
Hmm.
I know when I was new, like I was reading such vast books on such different topics, and I didn't know what I wanted. Like when I speak to absolute beginners, right? A lot of them come to me and they're like, I'm having trouble discerning what tradition to follow, what path to take. Like, where do I go? And I think this is why chaos magic is so popular amongst new people, actually.
It is.
It's kind of a solution to this problem, right? But I think it is hard to remain a chaos magician as you go far enough on your path. And actually, Phil Hine, one of the big chaos magic creators, doesn't even, I think, call himself a chaos magician anymore. I think he does like Eastern metaphysics now.
I think he says he started chaos magic, but I don't think he calls himself a chaos magician anymore.
Yeah, I think he like even him like diverged from it. I think it is hard to be a chaos magician forever because it's hard not to have some sort of root somewhere. Now, I don't think you need to solely follow one tradition, right? I'm actually pretty eclectic, but you need to have like a consistent and cohesive worldview. I think this is one of the challenges of new people actually is finding a cohesive worldview that like works together. Like for me, the reason why I was pulled towards Thelema is that it just gives you that, like it gives you a why. This was one of my big problems is I was like, well, why am I doing this? Why does this work? Like I wanted an explanation. And a lot of beginner books just kind of tell you like how to do things. They don't give like a reason. Like I wanted like a theory as to why it works, right? Because that's kind of how my brain works. I want to know why things work as well as like what I'm doing. Um, and I think yeah, like it's a lot of people like come to me and they're like, well, this is all really cool. How do I create a practice? And I mean, that's a question that I can guide people towards, sure, but I can't 100% answer that for someone. Often, what I'll do is I'll ask people like, "What's your background? What appeals to you?" Like, I have like a conversation, kind of helping them explore themselves. But I mean, it's not a question anyone can completely answer for you. And I kind of don't think we fully choose our paths. I had a very illuminating conversation with someone back when I lived in New York who had a background in kind of like African traditional religions. And they were telling me that in those traditions, you actually don't pick anything. Like you approach a house and a priest does a divination on you and they decide like what spirits you're with and you have to work with those spirits. And I think that's a bit extreme. I don't think that's exactly how it works, but I think that's closer to the idea that I don't think you 100% pick. I think you kind of pick, but you kind of don't. And that's like one of those many contradictions that's hard to explain to people. Because when you're new, like you're like reading 8 million books and you want to pick one and it's hard. I mean, finding your way is like a hard soul searching process that I don't think is it takes time. I mean, I think we're all still kind of figuring that out though, even as we go further along.
The great work is supposed to be full knowledge of the self, right? And that is one of the most difficult. The reason why finding your true will in Thelema, to my understanding, is so important is because that is actually excessively difficult. If it was easy, everyone would know what they were supposed to be doing, and we would all be following our true wills, and we would all have wonderful times doing whatever our true wills are. But that is an incredibly self knowledge and self mastery are two of the most difficult and important skills for all of spirituality at this point.
Yeah, it's why people spend years in therapy in secular culture. I mean, like, people go to, therapy for years to answer this question, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's one people everyone grapples with it. Like whether you're an occultist or not, this is just one specific way people grapple with it, and one that when you're an occultist, it becomes very clear you have to because otherwise you're going to be lost. Yeah, know thyself is hard. True will is hard. True will is another contradiction of sorts that makes sense when you understand it. Is true will is the path of least resistance, but to get on the path of least resistance, you have to basically like reject a lot because I think to one thing that when I was a new Thelemite I thought was kind of silly, but now I understand and think is very good is this idea of saying will before you eat, where you like say like the reason why you're drinking water is because it nourishes you and so you can find your true will and follow your true will. You eat the food so that you can have the strength, right? The reason why that is actually a valuable exercise is not because it's like literally blessing the food. That's not the point of that. But it's a reminder that every single little choice you make actually relates to your true will. Of course, your true will includes eating so that you don't die, but your true will is a constant thing. It's not an answer to a question. there's no like people think their true will is something they can do a single tarot reading on and understand. Like it's closer. I think this is like why Crowley really likes different versions of the Tao Te Ching and like Taoism so much, is that it's not Philem is nothing like Taoism except for this part. But it's the idea that you have to kind of live in constant alignment with your true will. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say there is a really funny thing, because this whole podcast is about beginner occult books and like the occult publishing industry, and we did segue into true will, but that's really important, because a lot, and part of it has been like writers not following their true wills by publishing just kind of garbage, right?
Oh yeah.
And
Well, because if you want to publish an occult book, I know this myself. Um, you have to, if you're going through a publisher. I mean, the reality is publishing is a business as much as it is like a creative endeavor. And so
Mhm.
if you are going through a publisher, you're either going to have to go to a very niche publisher, which a lot of people don't want to do because they want people to read the work they've created, which makes sense. If you pour your heart and soul into something and nobody reads it, that kind of sucks. um but if you go to a more major publisher, especially if you go to a non-occult, because there are like larger occult publishers, but even beyond that, like mainstream publishers are publishing occult books. The bigger you get, the less niche you get, the more they're going to want you to compromise on what you're writing so that they can sell books, because it's a business, right? They're not publishing these people for free. They want to make a return because, editors have to get paid, people have to eat. It makes sense. But there's constraints with that, right? Like if you self-publish your own occult books, which a lot of people do just so they can write whatever the hell they want and not care about market response, which is what I think I'm going to do for the manuscript I'm writing now, because it is specific. But I think it's yeah, you're limited, because these publishers, obviously they have things they want to put out. Like if you're a publisher making a plan, of course I've never worked for a publisher, but I assume they sit at the beginning of each quarter, like every other business, and are like, well, this is our goals. Like we want 2 tarot books, we want 2 books on Wicca, we want 2 books on ceremonial magic, right? I assume there's some sort of quota system, right? Just for the reality of running these businesses, where they just kind of can't, so just publish specific things. Like they have rules. And a lot of people, when they go into writing an occult book, realize very quickly that these publishers will want something specific out of what you're creating, right? They have specific goals because they want specific books made, which that's business, right? I don't I You can't 100% fault them for this, right? That's just how things work. We live in the material world.
can't really fault people for wanting to get paid and continuing their business, I don't think, no.
No, and like people who are writing occult books for a living, because there are people who that is their entire job. I mean, they've got to get a certain amount out at a certain frequency rate, because occult publishing does not pay very well. And they're like, okay, well, I've got to do this. Like it's pretty easy for these people to end up writing things that are not their true will, that are not divinely inspired, just because they need to keep writing, or they're told, well, we really need a book on the Wheel of the Year this year. Can you write the Wheel of the Year book? And someone who's not been published might say, yeah, like I want to get my foot in the door, right? And so there's a lot of like practical reasons why things have become how they are. And some of them I don't even think are inherently bad. Like, I do think we need way less tarot books. I'll say that as a straight up take. We do not need 9 million beginner tarot books, but you know, um, there's reasons why things are the way they are, and I don't know. It's just there's only interest in so much, and these very specific niche publishers are obviously harder to contact. If you write with them, I mean, you're probably not going to be able to make that your full-time job, which a lot of people want, so that they can focus solely on their writing. Which fair, once again. So it's very complicated, and it's kind of a mess for people who are trying to create occult books. And I don't fully know the solution. I mean, we think our one big opinion is we need intermediate books. I think those would do well. And if any occult publisher is listening to this by some small chance, like please publish intermediate books. People want them. People ask me about them. I've been asked for intermediate book recommendations many times. There are people who desire that, but it's hard. And since like occultism is not part of like if we were part of academia, people could write these really niche papers and get paid for them, like the way that the PhD system works with funding.
Yep.
But that we're not, unless you live in Amsterdam. So I don't know. People are kind of on their own, and it's a whole complicated situation.
It's a very complicated situation, and the main issue is that we have the problem of we're dealing with very high-minded spiritual topics, but the people writing those books about very high-minded spiritual topics still need to eat, and they still need to pay their bills, and they still need to be able to buy the ink to print new books so that they can go ahead and print new books and get the information out there. But at the end of the day, we cannot keep having more tarot books and more witchcraft books that ultimately the question is anyone going to remember this in about, I'm going to ballpark it, 4 years? Is anyone going to remember this book in 4 years? Unless it was their first book, the answer is probably going to be no for a lot of people, because even the first occult book, your first occult book is going to imprint something on you. I still find myself going back and rereading the first major occult book in my life and finding that I've adopted a lot of mannerisms that book has kind of instilled in me. But if you're not having it as your first occult book, maybe it's like your second or third, you probably won't remember a lot of books. You were a knowledge hound when you started out. How many of those books that you read when you were starting out do you actually remember?
Um, I don't know if I were to percentage hit. I mean, the thing is, what I remember when I was a knowledge hound is there was the first few books I read are not what I think of when I think of my first occult book that was impactful. Right? I
Right.
remember probably about the fourth book I read. I will name it Black Arts by Cavendish, which I think is from the 70s. I got it at a Barnes and Noble. It was like the one that looked the most serious and edgy based on the cover and the name. And the name is so unnecessarily edgy. I mean, the entire book is very clearly going for that 1970s bit of shock value. I don't know if I would recommend this book, but I will say it is better than a lot of beginner books.
Yeah.
It is it's decent. I mean, would I like say like I this book's so old I don't feel. I'm gonna look up what year it's from. I think it's the 70s.
Yeah.
It is. Let me check. It should say 1968.
Oh, that's a
Uh,
really old book. Yeah.
yeah, it got republished when Mitch Horowitz wrote an introduction of it. It seems so, but this has been being published for a long time, and this does get sold amongst the beginner books because it reads like it's not actually that old, but it has that kind of that time period flair to it, and it's I don't know, it's better than a lot of other beginner books, but I mean, is it like necessarily one I'd recommend? I don't know, but that one sticks out in my head very clearly, and that one had the first impact on me, I would say. Other ones I read early on, there's a few that stick out in my head. A lot of them blur together because I was reading a lot of very beginner books because I was going to the public library. I read every single occult book in the public library near me, which was not that many. I went to Barnes and Noble and like those type of shops, and I read the best ones. And then I obviously went on the internet and learned about better occult books and then read those. But I mean, a lot of them blur, especially the stuff that was in the public library, which was like kind of dated, like Wicca type stuff. Um, yeah, I mean, that's what happens though. If you consume information at such a crazy volume, you're not going to retain all. Like you're just not going to retain all of it. And also, like inevitably, if you're new, you're going to read some books that don't actually make an impact on you, or don't relate to your path. Like 3 months later, um, yeah, I mean, there's a couple that 100% stick out to me, but I mean, not all of them for sure.
And that's
Um,
part of the problem of being in the knowledge hound phase, right? Because if you're reading books, especially if I would say that this goes mostly if the books you're reading are very, very similar, you're going to just blend them together and you're not going to remember, you know, being generous. Like, you're not going to remember 60% of what is in that book just because it's going to blend together in your mind with like maybe three other books, right? Some people have the opportunity to read like a book every week, right? And if you're in that period of reading, like, maybe you're the kind of person who is somehow able to just plow through books at a crazy speed and you're reading 2 books a week, you're not going to process that information properly at all because it's going to be going into your mind and out of your mind so fast that you need to actually have time to actually process that information. So when you go through that, yes, you're going to have read so many books, but how many books are you actually like retaining the information from? That's also a thing that I don't think we talk about as much as we maybe should. Um, you can't just go through and plow through all of the books, To use a beginner occult book, you can't plow through all 10 versions of the Equinox in like a week and retain any of it. I don't think is a
Yeah, no. I mean, also, I think what is also needs to be brought up is occult books. If you're trying to not be an armchair magician, you should be like using in your practice. And if you are actually using the books you are reading, if they're ones that are like that and not one that explain like metaphysical theory, your reading speed's gonna be slowed down. Like I remember one book that I actually did all the rituals in early on, and that had a big impact is Seven Spears by Rufus Opus,
that's a good
which
one.
a series of rituals that initiate you into the planets. And this is how I got my planetary magic obsession that is now like the core of my practice, right? It's a very good book actually. It's a good intro to planetary magic, and I did all the rituals in it. You do 7 initiations into the 7 spears. It's like kind of grimoire style. I started with Saturn and then went to the sun because of course I wanted to be contrarian. But that I did that over the course of 7 weeks. And that I think is the fastest speed you could do those rituals at, unless you literally were doing one every day, which what's the point of doing an initiation every day? That's like a bit much. But I did that in 7 weeks. That's fast.
I think
Um,
the only way you could do it faster is if you started with Moon and went up, then you could do it in 2. But you did basically the fastest, yeah. The fastest, safest way, I would say.
yeah. And 7 initiations in 7 weeks is a lot. And yeah, I mean, if you're using the books, like that's 7 weeks for, I don't know how long that book is. I think it's like probably, I don't know, 200 pages. It's not
Something like
very
that.
it's not a long one. If you're actually using the concepts in the book you're reading, like your reading speed is going to be slowed down. Now, I think there is nothing wrong with reading books that you don't use in your practice, but if you're trying to like develop your practice, you want to at least apply some of it. So some books are going to take you a really long time to read, especially like The Black Brick by Rigardi. If you were to work through the entire Black Brick curriculum, I mean that's years, years into that book.
If you read that front to back, I'm sorry. Most people shouldn't be reading it that way, but you could theoretically read that book in like a year and practice all of it, and you would probably be pretty well off. But you definitely shouldn't be reading the Black Brick in a day or a week or even a month, I would say, because that book is like 700 pages of multiple different entire types of magic. There's an entire lecture on tarot in some editions that is followed up by geomancy and then Enochian. It's I'm probably getting the order of those wrong, but those are all in the same book. So they're radically different, not including all of the initiatory work in that book. So if you're actually practicing it, it should take you somewhere in the realm of like 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I mean these books are really, if you're using them and you're applying all of it to your practice, you're slowed down. Um, and you can read things while you're slowed down, like reading the Equinox, right? The Equinox, you can, that is not, a lot of that is not rituals, a lot of that is essays or whatever. You can plow through the Equinox, why not? Sure. But if you're using like a curriculum based grimoire, you can't really plow through that and gain the maximum impact. I do remember on Discord, I interacted with someone who wanted to speedrun the Goetia by evoking all the demons at once. And that's an approach, but maybe not.
That's called the ending of the Abermelon. That's what that is.
Yeah, this beginner just like speed run the Obermelon. They apparently did this allegedly. I like to think they actually went through with it, just because that's insane.
It's pretty wild. Yeah.
Day 1, evoke the entire Goetia.
Day 2, recover.
All right, so I realize we've been talking for a long time. Dave, do you have any other points you want to hit on? Any other takes before we close this out? As this is now an epic of a podcast. This is a black brick of a podcast.
Oh, I was ready for the full 3 hours you jokingly signed me up for, so I'm good. No, there is one thing I want to say as our kind of closing thoughts. No, not all beginner occult books are bad, but there's too many of them, and it makes it difficult for people to actually get to the niche subjects that they're going to want to learn about. For example, I'm looking into talismans. That's my big goal for this year in 2025 is I want to get really into talisman magic. I have no interest in plant magic, right? So if you are a publisher planting a bunch of stuff or printing a bunch of things about plant magic, I'm not going to read them. Likewise, some people I know are really into plant magic, right? Those niche topics, we need more books of those niche topics because having to go through the older books, like, Scott Cunningham is a prolific author. I usually use Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. Having to go through those instead of having like a convenient modern book that is honestly fairly easy to get a hold of is kind of a problem for the people who are eventually going to get into those niche topics themselves. And also, I guess I have one thing. The first beginner occult book that I ever had, I kind of found on accident, and that beginner occult book is the reason I'm here. Without those beginner occult books, we wouldn't be podcasting right now. Without these beginner books, we would not be having this conversation about the fact that the publishing industry needs to develop with its audience. It's a problem of we are complaining about this not because we hate the occult publishing industry. We hate it because we know it can do better because it has affected us in major ways to the point where we want to see it grow and develop like we have in our spiritual practice instead of stagnate where we originally were. My last major tweet of 2025 was about how we started going back to more niche and more soulful projects across culture in 2024. That was a big thing in 2024. I'd love to see that happen to occult publishing in 2025.
Yeah,
And
occult
maybe
publishing.
2026 because books take forever.
You guys could do some really cool stuff. You guys, I have some suggestions. Intermediate books, niche topics, stuff that could be, you guys could do something really cool is introductory books about specific writers to help you understand them. I know there's a beginner, it's called like the Wiser Concise Reader to Aleister Crowley, that gives you all the information you need to start reading Crowley immediately. Those books are very good. Those are good beginner books. Those are very valuable. Less tarot books. We do not need 9 million books on the Rider-Waite tarot.
Please don't. No more.
There are enough. Too many tarot. Yeah, and bookstores who are definitely not listening to my podcast. Stock those niche occult publishers. They do really cool stuff, and a lot of them are really annoying to order from if you do not live in the same country they're in. So that would make my life easier. That one's my real like wish that's not going to happen. And yeah, to people listening, there are good books out there. Just please use discernment. And to determine a good book is not to see how many citations are in the back. Okay? You guys' citation obsession is kind of annoying and not really how metaphysics work. Now, I don't think citations are bad, but it is not the sole determiner of merit. Yeah, it's just, this is not.
There is actually one that I personally like to use. If you are asking about a book and no one can tell you how quality it is, and you keep asking about it and that continues to happen, I see, if it's not brand new, I see it as a flaw against the book. Recently, I've had a lot of people asking me about particular spiritual schools, and I immediately had to step back and say, I have literally only seen people ask me if this is good, and no one has actually finished this spiritual school, or they've just disappeared, right? They've disappeared off the face of the internet. So if you go to people, like if you go to people who read a lot of occult books and they can't tell you that, yeah, this is a good idea, and they just say like, yeah, all I keep hearing is people asking me about it, kind of look at that a little bit suspect.
That's a good point. So I will, in this podcast, I apologize for you believing that I meant this would actually last 3 hours. I just went over my normal time.
No, I figured it was a joke.
Okay, good. And yeah, everyone listening to this podcast is supported by Patreon. You get a bonus episode 8 times a year. You get a mini episode before every episode that I record before my guest shows up. I am Dot Darling on every platform under the sun. I'm supported through Patreon. Dave, where can people find you?
I am over at patreon.com/Amateur Magus, youtube.com/Amateur Magus, twitter.com/Amateur Magus, Instagram, even though I don't publish anything there. Yeah, I'm Amateur Magus basically everywhere. Hopefully it will be in the description of this video. Yeah.
Yeah, everything will be in the description of the show notes. Thank you all for hanging in to the end. That is very impressive. And I will see you all in the next one. This has been the Postmodern Iconoclast. And have an amazing day, night, afternoon, mid morning, mid evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye.